The patient on table 3 had no pulse, and neither, in any meaningful sense, did Dr. Elias Voss. Not until the doors of Trauma Bay slammed open and a stranger in scrubs shoved him aside with both hands, pressed his own onto the man's chest, and began compressions with the focused ferocity of someone who had made a private agreement with death and intended to keep it. Elias stood there with the paddles still in his hands, heart thudding, and watched this man work. This man he had never seen before in 4 years at Mercy. General felt something split open behind his sternum that had nothing to do with the crisis in front of him, and everything to do with the line of that stranger's jaw, the controlled fury in his dark eyes, the way his whole body moved like it had been built for exactly this moment. The stranger's scrubs, unmarked, no badge visible, hair curling damply at his temples, as though he'd come in from rain, did not stop compressions to introduce himself. He said, low and clear, "Get me epi, 1 milligram," and someone call a code, and the nurses moved for him the way people always move for someone who sounds certain, which is to say immediately and without question. Elias remained still for exactly 2 seconds longer than he should have, which was 1 second of genuine shock and 1 second of something he refused, in that moment, to examine. Then his training kicked in, and he was beside the stranger, and they worked in tandem, epi, shock, rhythm check, and 4 minutes later, the man on the table coughed back into life with the violent, bewildered gratitude of someone who hadn't expected to return. The stranger stepped back, exhaled once through his nose, and only then looked at Elias fully, and the eye contact was so direct, so unhurried, that Elias felt it somewhere low in his rib cage, like a tuning fork struck against bone. "Rafael Mora," the stranger said, "Cardiothoracic. I transferred from Johns Hopkins this morning. I was told to find Dr. Voss." He paused, and something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, not quite amusement, something older and more complicated than either. "I assume that's you." Elias said yes. He said his name. He said, "Welcome to Mercy, General." He said all the correct words in the correct order and was quite proud of this achievement, because his entire nervous system was doing something he had no framework for and no intention of investigating in a trauma bay with a resuscitated patient between them and 3 nurses watching. Rafael Mora was 34 years old, board certified in cardiothoracic surgery, the author of 2 papers that Elias had read and cited, and the most physically beautiful human being Elias had encountered in his adult life, which was a thought he filed immediately under inadmissible and moved on from with the practiced efficiency of a man who had spent a decade being very good at not thinking about certain things. He was olive-skinned and broad-shouldered and moved through the hospital the way some people move through the world, as if the space around them quietly rearranges itself out of respect. His hands, Elias noticed this, the way you notice a fact you don't want, were extraordinary, large and steady and precise. Surgeon's hands. Elias had surgeon's hands too, long-fingered and careful, and he had never in his life given a single thought to anyone else's hands until he watched Raphael's settle on a patient's wrist to check a pulse, and felt his mouth go dry. They were assigned adjacent offices. This was apparently the universe's idea of a joke. The first week passed in the productive, almost aggressive professionalism of 2 people who are very good at their jobs and determined to demonstrate this at all times. They consulted on 2 shared patients. They spoke in the abbreviated, precise language of specialists: ejection fraction, wall motion, reperfusion, and Elias told himself that the slight tension he felt in every one of these conversations was the normal friction of adjusting to a new colleague's approach. Different training, different instincts. He told himself this was unremarkable. He told himself a great many things that first week. The second week, they got coffee. It was not a plan. Elias was standing at the machine in the break room at 11:30 at night, after a 6-hour surgery, running on fumes, and the particular hollow clarity of exhaustion. And Rafael came in still in scrubs, with a look on his face that Elias was beginning to recognize. The look of a man who has been holding his composure for too many hours, and is momentarily, privately, setting it down. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The machine gurgled. Outside, the hospital hummed its endless hum. "Good surgery?" Rafael asked. His voice at that hour was different, lower, less armored. Elias noticed this and wished he hadn't. "Patient lived," Elias said, "which is the only metric that matters at midnight." He handed Rafael the coffee he'd just poured, almost without thinking, and got himself another, and Rafael took it with a look that was something between surprised and pleased. And they stood at the window together watching the rain, and drank their bad hospital coffee, and talked, not about medicine, not about patients, but about other things, about the cities they'd trained in, about what they read, about the specific loneliness of residency, which they described to each other with the relief of soldiers. Comparing notes on a war they'd both survived. Rafael was from Seville originally, had moved to the States at 19 for college, carried his accent like a piece of luggage he'd stopped trying to lose. He laughed with his whole body when something struck him as genuinely funny. He listened the way attentive people listen, not waiting for his turn to speak, but actually absorbing, actually present. And Elias found this so disarming that at one point he said something true that he hadn't intended to say. Something about feeling, in the years since his last relationship ended, like he was living at a slight remove from his own life. And Rafael looked at him with an expression of such immediate recognition that Elias had to look away. "I know exactly what you mean," Rafael said. That was all. But the quiet that followed was the comfortable kind, the kind that only exists between people who have recognized something in each other. And Elias sat in it, and tried to ignore the warmth that spread through his chest, like contrast dye through a coronary artery, illuminating, total, and impossible to unsee. He drove home at 1 in the morning, thinking about hands. He stood in his apartment for a long time, without turning on all the lights. Just the lamp by the window, and he looked at the city outside, its honest, indifferent aliveness, and he felt, for the first time in years, something other than managed. He felt the particular, slightly unsteady aliveness of a man who has let himself want something out loud, and who has been met in that wanting, and who does not yet know what to do with the enormousness of that. He texted Rafael good night. "A simple thing," Rafael replied, "also simple. Sleep well." And then, after a pause, "Thank you for tonight." And Elias stood in the lamplight, holding his phone, and felt the warmth of those 4 words move through him, like something clinical, and entirely not like contrast, like dye, like illumination. The weeks that followed were a kind of education. He couldn't have said exactly when or exactly how, only that he began to be aware of Rafael's presence in a room before he saw him, some alteration in the atmosphere, some frequency his body had apparently begun to track without consulting him. He would be reviewing films at the light board, and feel the awareness a moment before Rafael appeared in the doorway. He would be scrubbing in, and know, without looking up, that Rafael had entered the scrub room. He began to find this both remarkable and deeply inconvenient. Rafael, for his part, seemed to find excuses. Small ones, subtle ones, a question about a patient that could have been emailed, a consult that could have gone to another attending. A coffee he placed on Elias's desk with a knock, and a look through the glass partition, and nothing else. Just a look that lasted a beat longer than a look between colleagues needs to last. Elias noticed all of this with the careful, clinical attention he gave to diagnostic data, cataloging each instance, building a picture he wasn't sure what to do with. The moment that broke his composure, the first real break, the one he couldn't rationalize, happened on a Tuesday afternoon in a supply closet, which is not where Elias had imagined his composure breaking, but which, on reflection, is exactly the kind of ordinary, undignified location where important things happen. He had gone in to find a particular type of suture. Rafael had apparently gone in for something else and was already there in the narrow space between the shelves, reading a label with his reading glasses on. Elias had not previously been aware that Rafael wore reading glasses, and this information hit him with a disproportionate force he could not account for, and when Elias pulled the door shut behind him, out of habit, the closet became suddenly, acutely small. Rafael looked up. He did not remove the glasses. He did not step back. The fluorescent light above them buzzed faintly, and the space between them was approximately 18 inches. Close enough that Elias could see the faint scar at Rafael's left eyebrow, and close enough that when Rafael exhaled, Elias felt it. Sutures, Rafael said. He was looking at Elias with an expression that Elias had learned to recognize over 3 weeks, direct, composed, with something moving underneath it, like current under ice. Yes, Elias said. He didn't move. Neither did Rafael. The 18 inches stayed exactly 18 inches, and they both stood in the buzzing light, and Elias was acutely, entirely aware of his own heartbeat, and of the fact that he had never in years felt this much from this little, from just a man standing close to him with reading glasses. And a suture box. Rafael reached past him for something on the shelf behind Elias's shoulder, and his arm passed near enough that Elias felt the warmth of it along his collarbone, and he closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. 1 second, he would later be grateful, no one witnessed, and breathed. When he opened them, Rafael was looking at him again, and something in his face had changed, had softened just slightly at the edges, had become careful, in the way faces become careful when they're trying not to say the thing they're thinking. Elias, Rafael said, just his name, quietly, like a question, with no question mark. Elias left the closet. He walked back to his office with the wrong sutures and sat at his desk for 7 minutes, doing absolutely nothing before pulling up a patient chart and forcing himself back into the reliable, steadying grammar of medicine. He called his friend Dara that night. Dara, who was an ER attending and his oldest friend, and the only person in his life who knew all of his truths, and said, without preamble, "Something is happening," Dara said. "Tell me." He told her. All of it, in careful order, because he was a man who processed things in careful order. The trauma bay, the coffee, the closet, the glasses, the 18 inches, the way Rafael said his name. Dara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Elias, honey, this has been happening for 3 weeks. You're just telling me now," he said. "I don't know what to do with it." She said, "Yes you do," and she hung up, which was Dara's way. And he sat in the dark of his apartment holding his phone and looking at the ceiling and admitting to himself, carefully, like unpacking something fragile, that he was in trouble of the very best and very most inconvenient kind. The following morning he arrived early. He was always early. He liked the hospital in the hours before it fully woke. The corridors quiet, the particular blue light of early morning filtering through the east-facing windows. He was in his office reviewing the day's schedule when Rafael knocked on the open door, and Elias looked up and felt the thing in his chest pulled tight. Rafael looked like he hadn't slept. Not badly. He was too composed for that, too carefully put together, but there was something around his eyes. He came in and sat in the chair across the desk without being asked, which he had started doing in the 2nd week, and which Elias had never objected to. He set his coffee down. He looked at Elias. "I need to say something," Rafael said, "and if I'm wrong, you can tell me. And I will apologize professionally and sincerely, and we will never discuss it again." Elias put his pen down. His heart was doing something medically interesting. "I'm not wrong," Rafael said. "I don't think I'm wrong, but I'm asking." He held Elias's gaze with that steadiness that Elias had catalogued over 3 weeks. That quality of looking at something and not flinching from it. I want to know if what I feel in every room we're in together is something I'm feeling alone. The silence lasted for seconds. Elias counted them, because he was the kind of man who counted things. No, Elias said. You're not feeling it alone. Something happened to Raphael's face then. Not a smile. Not quite. More like a release. Like a long-held breath, let go. He sat back. He picked up his coffee. He looked out the window at the morning coming in, and when he looked back at Elias, something between them had shifted into alignment, the way a joint sounds when it finds its proper place. Small and certain and instantly relieving. Okay, Raphael said. Good. He said it, like they had established a clinical fact, and could now proceed accordingly, which was, Elias thought, exactly the right way to say it. He spent the following 2 days doing exactly what he always did when something had unsettled him. He worked. He took on extra consults, reviewed charts he could have delegated, volunteered for a complex laparoscope repair that kept him in the OR until 9. He was useful and efficient and present, and inside all of that useful efficiency, he was thinking about Rafael Mora's hands, and the word okay, and the tone in which it had been delivered, and the specific quality of the relief on Raphael's face when Elias said no, you're not feeling it alone, which was the face of a man who had been carrying something he hadn't been sure he'd have to carry alone, and had just learned otherwise. He was scrubbing out after a procedure on Thursday when Raphael appeared at the scrub sink beside him, systematic and unhurried, and they scrubbed in companionable silence for a moment, and Elias thought about how quickly this had become normal, this man's presence beside him, the sound of water, and the smell of iodine, and the quality of Raphael's silence, which was never empty. Are you free Saturday? Raphael asked. He was looking at his hands under the water. Elias's pulse did something inadvisable. Yes, he said. Good, Raphael said. That was all. He turned off his tap and dried his hands and went to his OR, and left Elias standing at the sink with the distinct impression that the word Saturday had physically altered the density of the air. He texted Dara. He asked me too, Saturday. She replied immediately. What did I tell you? Followed by 3 separate celebratory emoji. Followed by, wear the blue shirt. He did not wear the blue shirt. He wore a gray linen shirt he'd had for years that fit well, and he met Raphael at the address Raphael had texted him, which turned out to be a small Spanish restaurant in a neighborhood Elias didn't know well, the kind of place that is clearly good because it has no effort put into seeming good, slightly cramped tables, handwritten specials, wine list on a single chalkboard. He arrived first, which was his way. Raphael arrived 3 minutes later, with rain on his jacket, and a look that Elias had catalogued, the look of someone who is pleased to see the person they were expecting, and is not working very hard to hide it. They ate for 2 hours. They drank good wine slowly. The restaurant filled up around them and emptied again, and they remained, refilling their glasses and letting the conversation go wherever it wanted, which was many places, medical school miseries, the particular comedy of surgical residency, the cities they'd lived in before settling here. Raphael talked about his year in Madrid after residency, the hospital there, the way the city moves, slow mornings, nights that don't begin until midnight. Elias talked about a fellowship in London, grey and expensive and wonderful, the hospital on the Thames, the specific quality of English rain, which is nothing like Spanish rain, and nothing like the rain here. Raphael watched him talk about London with an expression of undisguised interest, leaning forward slightly, elbows on the table, and Elias felt it, being watched like this, being heard like this, like sunlight on a surface that hadn't seen much of it. You liked it there, Raphael said. London, I did, Elias said. I thought about staying. What stopped you? Elias considered. I don't know exactly. I think I was looking for something I wasn't going to find in London. Something I didn't have a name for yet. He paused. Rafael was still. I came back here and I worked very hard and I was very good at things and I had a good life. A productive life. Just not a full one, Rafael said. Elias looked at him. Not a full one, he agreed. Rafael poured the last of the wine into Elias's glass without asking. This was the kind of small presumption that Elias had started to realize he loved. The unasked assumption of permission, of closeness, and sat back and looked at him. I've moved a lot, Rafael said. Johns Hopkins, then a year in New York, now here, and every time I arrive somewhere, I tell myself this time, I'll put down roots. This time I'll let myself actually settle. He turned his glass. I don't know if I've known how. Maybe you hadn't had the right reason, Elias said. Rafael looked at him, slow, direct, the quality of the look. Landed somewhere Elias had been hoping it would land, and he held it, held the eye contact, because he had decided he was done being careful about certain things. Maybe, Rafael said, and he smiled fully, for the first time since Elias had met him, a smile that went all the way to his eyes and altered the whole architecture of his face, and Elias thought, I am in so much trouble, and it is the absolute best kind. They had dinner that Friday. Elias chose a restaurant, 3 neighborhoods away from the hospital, which was a calculation he made and did not examine too closely. They sat across from each other at a small table by the window, with a candle between them and the city, doing what cities do outside, indifferent, continuous, alive, and they talked for 3 hours. Not about medicine this time, about everything else. Rafael talked about his family in Seville, his mother, who called every Sunday and pretended not to cry when they hung up, his father, who expressed love exclusively through practical acts, fixed things, built things, showed up with food. He talked about being 21 and knowing what he was and the particular loneliness of medical school where there was no time for anything and certainly no time for the complicated work of being yourself. Elias talked about his own version of that, his own timeline, the relationship in his late 20s that had been real and good and had ended the way good things end when 2 people are both running hard at their careers that they gradually outpace each other without meaning to. The year since, which had been full and professionally satisfying and quietly, persistently lonely in a way he had mostly managed not to look at directly. Rafael listened to all of this. He rested his chin in his hand and watched Elias's face while he talked, and did not offer comfort or advice. Just listened, which was the exact right thing, and Elias felt it, like a hand on the back of his neck, steadying, warm. They split the check. They walked out into the cool night and stood on the sidewalk, and Elias thought, something is going to happen now, and felt neither afraid nor certain of what he wanted to do about it. Rafael stood with his hands in his pockets, looking at him, and the streetlight caught the planes of his face, jaw and cheekbone, and that slight scar, and Elias thought about the supply closet and the 18 inches, and the way his name had sounded. I'd like to walk, Rafael said. If you would. They walked. The city arranged itself around them, lit windows, distant traffic, the smell of rain that had fallen earlier still clinging to the pavement. They walked without a destination and talked and stopped occasionally to look at things, a bookshop window, a street musician packing up his saxophone, and at some point, without either of them marking the transition, their arms were touching as they walked, a line of warmth from shoulder to wrist, and neither of them moved away. It was Elias who stopped. It was Elias who turned. He had spent his whole adult life being the careful one, the measured one, the one who thought before acting and weighed things and made decisions with the thorough, unhurried caution he applied to a difficult diagnosis. And he understood that this quality had served him well and also cost him things, and he was very tired, in this specific moment, of being careful. He turned, and Rafael was already looking at him, already still, already waiting with the patience of someone who had learned to read exactly this kind of silence. "I want to kiss you," Elias said. He said it the way he'd said no. "You're not feeling it alone, like a clinical finding. Like a thing that was true, and therefore should be stated." Raphael's mouth curved, slowly, like sunrise. "Then kiss me," he said. So Elias did. It was not tentative. He had half expected it to be tentative, the first real thing after so long. After 3 weeks of cataloging and restraining, but there was nothing tentative in it. Raphael's hand came up to his jaw, warm and steady as everything else about him. And the kiss was slow and thorough and so completely unhurried that Elias felt the city tipping slightly, felt the years of careful management dissolving in warm increments, felt himself arriving somewhere he hadn't known he'd been traveling toward. When they separated, it was by inches. Raphael kept his hand where it was. Elias was aware that he was breathing differently and didn't care. "I've wanted to do that," Raphael said quietly, "since you handed me a coffee at 11:30 at night without being asked." Elias laughed. It came out surprised and real, and Raphael looked at it, looked at his laugh. "The way you look at something you've been waiting to see." They took a cab back. They did not go in together. They were still doctors at a hospital they worked at together, and the calculus of that was real and would require navigation. But at Elias's building, Raphael held the cab door and leaned in and kissed him once more, brief and certain, like a period at the end of a sentence. "Sleep," he said. And Elias went inside, feeling the particular, incandescent restlessness of a man who has been given something. He didn't know he was starving, for sleep was not immediately possible. The weeks that followed were a kind of education, not in medicine. In this, they were both already fluent, but in each other, in the specific grammar of the other person. Elias learned that Raphael cooked on his days off, with the focused pleasure of someone who finds the work itself meditative. That he had opinions about coffee that bordered on theological, that he was privately, quietly funny in a way that only emerged when he was comfortable. And that comfortable, for Raphael, was a word he wore carefully. Having learned that not every space deserved it, Raphael learned that Elias ran in the mornings, when something was sitting on his chest unresolved, that he read fiction when he needed to be somewhere else for an hour, that he expressed affection through acts rather than words, through the remembered detail, the small consideration, the thing done without announcement. He learned that Elias had a laugh that arrived slowly and left quickly and was worth every effort it took to produce it. He learned that Elias was underneath the competence and the composure, both softer and braver than he looked. At work they were professional, scrupulously, almost amusingly professional, though it was Dara who found it amusing. Dara, who watched them across the nurse's station one afternoon and texted Elias, "The performance you two are giving is extraordinary and you should both win something." Elias texted back, "Focus on your patients." She sent a laughing emoji, but the professionalism held because they were both serious, people who understood what was at stake in a hospital, and because there is something, its own kind of erotic, about discipline, about looking at someone across a room full of patients and colleagues and holding the knowledge of them like a coal, kept carefully in the closed hand. Elias became intimately familiar with this particular sensation. He would be presenting a case at a whiteboard and feel Raphael's eyes on him from across the room. Not inappropriate. Never inappropriate. Just attentive in a way that had a different quality than attention from anyone else, and he would feel it in his shoulders, in the back of his neck, a warmth that he was very good at not showing. Raphael, he discovered, was less good at hiding it, or perhaps simply less concerned with hiding it. Once, in a team meeting, Elias made a point about a patient's evolving presentation, a lateral observation, a connection between two data points that no one else had made, and when he looked up from the chart, Raphael was watching him with an expression that was not remotely professional. That was in fact the expression of a man who is proud and attracted and not particularly working to conceal either. And Elias had to look very deliberately at the whiteboard for several seconds. The first night Rafael stayed was a Saturday in October. They had spent the evening at Elias's apartment takeout, a film that neither of them fully watched. The gradual, easy collapse of distance that happens when two people have been circling each other and finally stop circling. They had been talking for hours, and it was late, and neither of them was moving toward the exit. And at some point the talking became something else. Became Rafael's hand at the back of Elias's neck, and Elias's forehead tipping forward to rest against his. And the night doing what nights do, when you stop paying attention to them, deepening, quieting, becoming its own world. Rafael's hands were everything Elias had thought they would be. He had spent weeks noticing those hands in surgical contexts, their precision, their confidence. The way they moved with the assurance of someone who trusted them completely, and in this context they were all of that and more. They were slow and deliberate and curious, moving over him like something being learned rather than taken, and Elias, who had been alone for years and had managed this aloneness with reasonable dignity, found that the simple fact of being touched with attention, real attention, unhurried and present, undid him in a way he hadn't anticipated. He said Rafael's name, once, quietly. Rafael pulled back and looked at him in the low light of the apartment, that direct, reading look. "Okay," he said. "Yes," Elias said. "I'm very okay." His voice had done something he couldn't entirely control. Had gone lower, rougher, and Rafael looked at it, at what it meant, and something shifted in his face. Something that had been composed and careful becoming warmer, more open, and he kissed him again, slowly and thoroughly, and the night gathered itself around them like a quiet country. What Elias had not known, what he hadn't had the referent to know, was how it felt to want someone this completely and to have that wanting met in kind. He'd had good relationships. He'd had real connection. But this was different. In some way he struggled to articulate even internally, even to himself in the after-quiet, when Rafael was asleep beside him and the city was dark and Elias lay awake in the very best possible way. This felt like recognition, like the particular relief of having a word finally arrive for something you'd been describing around for years. He fell asleep with Rafael's arm heavy across his chest, listening to his breathing even out, feeling the warmth of him and the weight, and he thought, "Oh, this is what I was being careful toward." He fell asleep with Rafael's arm heavy across his chest, listening to his breathing even out, feeling the warmth of him and the weight, and he thought, "Oh, this is what I was being careful toward." In the morning, Rafael made coffee, while Elias was still in that particular state of wakefulness that is not yet fully committed to the day, lying in bed, listening to the sounds from the kitchen, the grinder, water running, the muted percussion of a person who knows where things are because they have paid attention. He lay there and looked at the ceiling and catalogued the feeling. Precisely, he felt like someone who had been holding their breath underwater and had just broken the surface. Not new, not exactly new, more like remembered, like returning to a place that was yours before you had the language to name it. Rafael brought him coffee. He sat on the edge of the bed and handed it over without ceremony, and Elias sat up and took it, and they sat there in the Sunday morning light, not saying anything for a moment. And it was easy, simple and easy, in the way that truly right things are easy, not effortless, but unstrained, like breathing. "I should tell you something," Rafael said finally. Elias looked at him. I haven't done this in a long time," Rafael said. He said it plainly, without apology, just as a fact being shared. "I've been very good at the work and somewhat unavailable for everything else, and I want you to know that I know that. So you know what you know what this is." Elias thought about this. He looked at the coffee. He looked at Rafael, who was watching him with the expression of a man who has said a careful thing and is now sitting in the accuracy of it. I haven't either, Elias said, in a long time. He paused. I think that might be why it feels this way. Rafael tilted his head slightly. Like we're both arriving at something, Elias said, rather than one of us dragging the other into territory they already know. Rafael was quiet for a moment. Something moved across his face, warm and recognizing and slightly undone. Yes, he said. That's exactly right. Elias drank his coffee. Rafael drank his. Outside, the city was doing what it does on Sunday mornings, which is being softer than usual. And the light came in at the angle that made Elias's apartment look like a painting of itself. And it was a good morning. It was a genuinely good morning, and Elias allowed himself to feel that without qualification, without the habits of restraint that had governed him for so long that he'd stopped noticing them. The snow came first. A Wednesday morning in early November, the first real snow of the season that actually stuck, and Elias found Rafael at the window of his office before rounds, standing with his coffee and watching it come down with the expression of someone encountering something that moves them and not trying to hide this. You like snow? Elias said. I didn't see it until I was 19, Rafael said, without turning. First winter in Boston. It was extraordinary. He paused. I still can't be fully rational about it. Elias stood beside him, and they watched the snow come down together, white and indifferent and beautiful. And the hospital went on behind them, paged, rolling, urgent, and they stood in the window for 3 minutes, being entirely useless, and neither of them minded. The difficult thing came a week later. It came in the form of a conversation that Elias hadn't planned and hadn't realized he needed to have until it was already happening. At 10 on a Friday night, sitting across from each other at Elias's kitchen table with the remnants of dinner between them, Rafael had made an offhand comment about a colleague, about an assumption the colleague had made, something small, and Elias had heard something underneath it, something about being seen in a particular way at work, being perceived in a way that Rafael had not chosen, and he'd said, "Does it bother you? What people know about us?" At the hospital, Rafael had been quiet. Not long, but long enough. Should it? He said. I don't think it should, Elias said. I'm asking if it does. Another pause. Rafael turned his wine glass. No, he said. And then, I spent a long time not being very available, to be seen. I think he stopped. Started again. I think there were years when being private was the same as being safe, and I stopped being able to tell the difference. And now, he looked up. Now, I don't particularly want to be invisible. No, Elias said. Good. I don't want you to be either. There was something in this exchange that mattered more than its surface. Something about the particular courage of two private men choosing to be visible in a professional space, choosing to be known, choosing to let the fact of each other be a public fact. They had not discussed it explicitly. They simply were, day by day, less concerned with managing the perception, and the hospital, which has its own ecosystem of observation and knowledge, understood accordingly and adjusted. The way institutions adjust when the thing they're adjusting to is quiet and inevitable. The first difficult thing was not the conversation. The first difficult thing was that Elias, in the weeks that followed, started to understand something about himself that was uncomfortable. He had built, over years of productive aloneness, a set of habits around his own interiority that were not conducive to partnership. He processed things alone. He resolved things internally, silently, and presented the world with the resolution rather than the process. He was generous and attentive and also, in certain specific ways, sealed. He figured this out because Rafael, who was himself private, who was himself not a man who overshared, would sometimes notice that Elias had been carrying something and not said so, and would say, simply, "You could have told me that." Not accusatory, just an observation. A reminder that the option existed. It was a form of accountability. Elias hadn't had in years, and it was slightly uncomfortable, and he knew that discomfort for exactly what it was. Growing. In the way that things grow when they're given what they need. He worked on it. He started saying things before he'd resolved them. He started saying, "I'm working through something," and then actually working through it out loud, with Rafael, who listened the way he always listened, fully present. Not fixing, not offering the resolution before Elias had found it. Just there. It was, Elias thought, one of the more intimate things he'd ever experienced. Possibly the most. November brought two things. The first difficult thing between them, and the first snow. The difficult thing was a patient, a 16-year-old named Marcus, who came in cardiogenic shock, following what his parents initially described as flu symptoms, and which was, in fact, on further investigation, a severe viral cardiomyopathy that had gone undetected for weeks. Rafael took the case. It was his area, his expertise, his operating room. Elias was a general surgery attending and had no clinical role, but Rafael was his something, was the person he ate with and talked to and fell asleep beside, and watching from the scrub room window while Rafael worked for 7 hours on a 16-year-old boy's heart. Was not an experience Elias had frameworks for. Marcus survived. He came out of the OR pale and small, and monitored within an inch of his life, and survived. Elias was waiting in the corridor when Rafael came out, and he read the answer in his face before he said a word, and the relief that moved through him was as physical and total as any emotion he'd felt in his adult life. They went to the supply closet, not for supplies, just to be somewhere enclosed and private for 3 minutes. And Rafael leaned against the shelf and pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes and exhaled, long and slow, and Elias stood in front of him and put a hand on his shoulder and said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say after 7 hours of holding someone's heart in your hands while their parents sat 40 feet away hoping. After a moment, Rafael looked up. His eyes were wet at the edges, which he clearly had no intention of remarking on, and Elias had the good sense not to remark on it either. Rafael covered Elias's hand on his shoulder with his own. "Thank you," Rafael said, "for being here." "I'll always be here," Elias said, and he meant it as a simple statement of intention, nothing dramatic, and was slightly surprised by how true it felt. They were not dramatic people. This was something they had in common. They were both constitutionally averse to excess, to performance, to the declarative gestures of feeling that they observed in others, and neither of them had ever been moved to enact. They expressed things sideways, through the remembered detail, through the considered act, through the quality of attention they paid each other in ordinary moments. Rafael started keeping things at Elias's apartment. A toothbrush first, which arrived without announcement. A book, left on the nightstand and not taken back. A coffee grinder that appeared in the kitchen one Sunday, with the unapologetic permanence of a thing that has found its right location. Elias watched these arrivals with the slightly stunned pleasure of a man who cannot believe his luck and is trying not to say so too loudly in case the luck notices and reconsiders. He said it to Dara instead, over bad cafeteria coffee one afternoon. "He's moving in," Dara said, "in the way people move in before anyone's agreed to it." "We haven't talked about it," Elias said. "You don't need to," Dara said. "The coffee grinder talked about it." She looked at him the way she'd been looking at him for years, fond and slightly exasperated. "Elias, you're happy?" He thought about this. He looked at the grain of the cafeteria table, and he thought about it carefully, the way he thought about everything. "Yes," he said, "I think I am." "Good," Dara said, "you've earned it. You've been quietly sad for years, and you were very professional about it, and it was very boring to watch." He looked at her. "I say that with love," she said. December arrived with cold, that bit in skies that went iron gray by 3 in the afternoon, and the hospital filling up with the season's attendant. Catastrophes, ice falls, flu complications, the particular cluster of cardiac events that cold weather reliably produces. They were both working too much, which was not unusual, and seeing each other in the gaps between, which was one night late, both of them just off long shifts. They were at Rafael's apartment this time, which Elias had gradually populated with his own leaving behind of objects, and they were cooking together in the kitchen, which had become a ritual they moved through with the unthinking ease of people who have done a thing enough times that the choreography has become unconscious. Rafael was at the stove, and Elias was chopping something, and they were talking about nothing much. About a paper Rafael was reviewing, about a documentary Elias wanted to watch. The ordinary content of a shared evening, and Elias had a moment, one of those moments that arrive without warning, that are simply suddenly thereof, looking up from the cutting board and seeing Rafael at the stove, in the low kitchen light, and feeling something so enormous and so quiet, simultaneously, that he stopped moving. Rafael noticed. He turned. Elias said, "I love you." He said it the way he said most things, plainly, without architecture, the way you state a finding you've confirmed and are confident in. Rafael was quiet for a moment. He turned fully from the stove. He looked at Elias with an expression that Elias had learned to read over months, the expression that meant Rafael was allowing himself to feel something he'd been holding back, like a door opened carefully. "I know," Rafael said. He crossed the kitchen. He took the knife very gently out of Elias's hand and set it on the board and held both of Elias's hands in his own, those extraordinary hands, and looked at him. "I've known for a while." He pressed Elias's hands briefly. "I love you too. I've been waiting for a moment that felt right to say it." "Does this feel right?" Elias asked. "You're holding an onion," Rafael pointed out. "But yes." Elias laughed, the surprised real laugh, the one that arrived quickly, and Rafael looked at it the way he always looked at it, with the particular expression of someone who has been given something they value, and kissed him once in the middle of the kitchen with the smell of garlic and the sound of something simmering, and the December cold pressed against the window outside. It was perfect. It was exactly right. It was the kind of moment that doesn't announce itself in advance, that isn't located in a restaurant or a scenic overlook or any of the curated places people go to have important moments, but in a kitchen on a Tuesday night, which is where most of the real things happen. January brought a crisis. The hospital kind, a staffing restructure that threatened to eliminate Rafael's position or transfer him to the satellite campus 20 miles out. Elias found out through an administrative memo and spent 4 hours in controlled fury before Rafael found him in his office, with the door closed, reading the same memo on his laptop. "You saw it," Rafael said. "I saw it," Elias said. "I was going to tell you tonight." "How long have you known?" Rafael said. 2 days. I was still processing." He said it evenly. But Elias had learned to read the evenness, had learned that for Rafael, evenness was often where difficulty lived, sealed under compression. "What are you going to do?" Elias asked. Rafael looked at him. "What are we going to do?" he said. It was a correction, a quiet one, an insistence on the pronoun. Elias felt something loosen in his chest. He had been sitting in the locked room of this for 4 hours, alone with the memo and his own calculations, and it hadn't once occurred to him to think of it as a problem he had a partner in, and now Rafael was sitting across from him, insisting on the plural, and it was such a simple thing, and it shifted everything. "What are we going to do?" Elias agreed. They fought the restructure together, professionally, carefully, through proper channels, letters of support from colleagues, documentation of clinical outcomes, meetings with administrators that required the particular brand of composed, data-supported advocacy that neither of them found easy, but both were capable of. Dara helped. 3 nurses helped. Marcus's parents, The parents of the 16-year-old boy Rafael had kept alive, wrote a letter to the board of their own accord that broke something open in Elias's chest when he read it. Not formally. Just a letter from two people saying what this doctor had meant, what this doctor had done. Rafael stayed. The position stayed. It was not dramatic. There was no single climactic meeting, no villain defeated. Just the slow accumulation of evidence that this was a thing worth fighting for until the administration agreed. They celebrated modestly, the way they did everything, dinner at the restaurant where they'd had their first one, the same table, the same candle, and Elias thought about who he'd been that night. How careful and conflicted and quietly hungry, and looked across at Rafael, who was looking back at him, and felt the difference between then and now, like the difference between a held breath and an exhale. Spring arrived gradually, as it always does, light returning in increments, the hospital courtyard discovering its own greenery again. Elias started running in the mornings with something other than unresolved tension propelling him. He ran because he liked it, because the city in early light was his, because he came home afterward to Rafael's coffee and Rafael's sleepy disagreement with his alarm clock and the particular pleasure of a morning that has a person in it. There was a conference in April, a cardiothoracic symposium in Boston, for days. Rafael went. Elias dropped him at the airport, and they stood at the curb with the cabs honking and the world being indifferent, and Rafael gripped the back of his neck and kissed him once, firm and brief, and said, 4 days. 4 days, Elias confirmed. Rafael looked at him. You're going to reorganize something while I'm gone. I'm not going to. Elias stopped. I might reorganize the bookshelf. The system is alphabetical by author. Elias, leave it. The system is arbitrary and emotionally incoherent. The system has meaning, Rafael said, with great dignity. The system, but Rafael was laughing, was picking up his bag, was walking toward the doors, was turning once at the threshold to look back with that expression, warm, private, entire, and then was gone. Elias drove back to the apartment. He did not reorganize the bookshelf. He reorganized one small section of the kitchen cabinet, while thinking entirely about other things. And Rafael came home 4 days later, and clocked it immediately, and said nothing, only looked at him with the expression that meant he was trying not to smile. They were, by June, the kind of thing that happened slowly, and then all at once. The kind of thing that looks, from outside, like it was always going to be this. Colleagues who didn't know the history assumed they'd been together for years. Colleagues who did know, Dara, a few of the nurses who had watched the supply closet era with interest, watched them and said nothing or said everything, depending on the colleague. Marcus came back in June, not in crisis, the opposite. He came back for a follow-up with his parents, and he was taller than Elias remembered, and he had the particular brightness of someone who has been close to not existing, and chosen to take the world seriously in response. Rafael was in the appointment. Elias happened to be in the corridor when they came out, and Marcus saw him and recognized him from the night of the surgery, from the blur of that night, and said, "You were there that night. You and Dr. Mora." Elias said yes. Marcus looked at him for a moment with the thoughtful, slightly unfiltered perception of a teenager. "Are you two together?" he asked. "Someone told me you are." His mother made a mortified sound. Rafael, beside Elias, was entirely still. "Yes," Elias said, "we are." Marcus nodded, satisfied, the way people are satisfied when a thing they suspected is confirmed. "Good," he said. "You both looked at each other weird that night, but like a good weird, I noticed from the gurney." He shrugged. "Just saying." His mother apologized. They all laughed. Marcus and his parents went down the corridor and around the corner, and Elias stood in the hallway, and Rafael stood beside him, and the hospital went on around them doing its perpetual, necessary work, and Rafael said quietly, without turning, "Noticed from the gurney." We were apparently not as subtle as I thought, Elias said. You were not subtle at all, Raphael said. I was subtle. You were not subtle. I was extremely subtle. You looked at me across a team meeting, like what? Elias turned to look at him. Raphael was looking back, and the hospital corridor was fluorescent and busy, and about as unromantic as a place can be. And Elias thought about the trauma bay, and the 18 inches in the supply closet, and a cab door on a street at night, and a kitchen on a Tuesday, and an airport curb, and every ordinary, extraordinary moment in the year since a stranger had shoved him aside in a trauma bay and pressed his hands onto a dying man's chest and saved 2 lives at once. Like you'd already decided something, Elias said. Raphael looked at him. That slow, warm thing at the corner of his mouth. I had, he said. He said it without apology, without drama, simply as a fact. Elias reached out and touched his arm, brief and light. The kind of touch that would read as nothing to anyone passing a colleague's gesture. Professional and forgettable, and said, just as simply, so had I? And they walked back to their offices in the good June light, separate and together, carrying between them something that had started in a crisis and built itself into a life, quiet and daily, and full of all the ordinary moments that turn out to be the actual architecture of the extraordinary. The coffee set on a desk without a word, the name said in the dark, the hand found in a difficult hour, the door of a cab held open on a late street, the love said in a kitchen, over an onion, while something simmered on the stove. This is not how love stories are supposed to work, Elias sometimes thought. They are supposed to have a clear arc, a moment of rupture and a moment of resolution, a before and an after. But what he had with Raphael did not work that way. What he had with Raphael was not a story about a before and an after. It was a story about showing up to the same life every day and choosing to build it with care. In the same way they chose every morning to show up to a hospital full of people who needed something from them, not because it was easy, not because it asked nothing, but because it was the most important thing they knew how to do. This is not how love stories are supposed to work, Elias sometimes thought. They are supposed to have a clear arc, a moment of rupture and a moment of resolution, a before and an after. But what he had with Raphael did not work that way. What he had with Raphael was not a story about a before and an after. It was a story about showing up to the same life every day and choosing to build it with care. In the same way they chose every morning to show up to a hospital full of people who needed something from them. Not because it was easy, not because it asked nothing, but because it was the most important thing they knew how to do. There were hard days. There were shifts that lasted 18 hours and left them both hollowed out and uncommunicative, sitting at opposite ends of the couch in the silence of people who have given everything they had to strangers and have nothing left for performance. There were nights Raphael came home from a surgery that hadn't gone the way it should have, and sat at the kitchen table with both hands around a glass and said nothing for a long time. And Elias learned not to fill this silence with words but with presence, sitting across from him, making tea, being simply there in the room, available without demanding anything. There were mornings Elias woke at 3 in the dark heart of the night with the specific cold clarity of a decision about a patient that he'd made 12 hours ago and was no longer certain of. And Raphael would wake too, had always been a light sleeper, and say simply, "Tell me," and Elias would tell him, precisely and fully, working through the logic, while Raphael listened. And 9 times out of 10 the telling was the thing that resolved it. They were good for each other in the way that the best partnerships are good, not by papering over each other's difficulties but by being specifically, precisely suited to help carry them. Where Elias closed inward under stress, Raphael opened, not effusively, not dramatically, but persistently, making space, keeping the door of communication held open with the patient constancy of someone who understands that some people need the door held rather than knocked upon. where Raphael tended to carry weight alone, holding difficult things at a compression that eventually built pressure. Elias had developed, over their months together, a precise sensitivity to this compression, could feel when Raphael was holding something, not by what he said but by the particular quality of his stillness, and had learned how to ask in a way that opened rather than confronted. They were, in the language that mattered, fluent in each other, and this fluency had not arrived fully formed, but had been built, deliberately and slowly, from the accumulated vocabulary of 1,000 small exchanges, the body language of early morning, the shorthand of shared meals, the grammar of the difficult conversation, and the forgiveness that followed it. It was work. It was the most worthwhile work either of them had ever done outside of medicine, and it shared something essential with medicine: the requirement of presence, of attention, of showing up consistently to something you believe in, even when it is hard, even when you are tired, even when it asks more of you than you feel you have. Raphael, on a Tuesday evening in August, standing in the kitchen with his hands in a colander of herbs, said without looking up, "You're thinking loudly." "I'm thinking quietly," Elias said. "You never think quietly." Raphael glanced over his shoulder. "What are you thinking?" Elias looked at him. Standing in the kitchen they had made together from the accumulation of two people's things, in the apartment that had become something different from what it was before, more inhabited, more real, more like the inside of an actual life. He looked at Raphael's profile, and the late light on it, and the gray that was just beginning at his temple, which Elias had first noticed in April, and which he found absurdly, devastatingly attractive. He had a memory then, unbidden, specific of the first time they had operated together. Not the resuscitation in the trauma bay, but a planned procedure 2 months into their knowing each other. A complex case that required both their disciplines. A collaboration that had been suggested by their chief of surgery with the brisk pragmatism of resource allocation, and which had turned out to be the most unexpectedly profound 2 hours Elias had spent in an operating room in years. Not because anything went wrong, because nothing did. Because they moved around each other with an ease that should not have been possible given how recently they'd met. Should not have been possible, given that 2 attending surgeons with separate training, and separate instincts, and separate years of cultivated habit do not typically slot together without friction. But they had. They had communicated in the abbreviated, precise shorthand of people who have already learned each other's language, who have already developed trust, and Elias had had this strange, vertiginous experience of knowing, in the middle of a surgery, that the person across the table from him understood exactly what he needed before he asked, and he had filed this away in the part of him that was trying not to feel too much too quickly. And the part that was failing, he had told Raphael afterward, months afterward, when he had language for it. He had said, "That surgery was the moment I knew." And Raphael had looked at him and said, "The hands. I watched your hands, and I thought, yes." And they had both agreed, laughing slightly at themselves, that it was perhaps quintessentially them to have an emotional revelation in the middle of a sterile field. "I'm thinking," Elias said now, in the kitchen in August, "that I'm very glad you walked into my trauma bay." Raphael was quiet for a moment. He set the colander down. He turned. He looked at Elias, with the expression that meant he was feeling something large and declining. To make it smaller for the sake of composure, which was a thing he had become, over time, better at allowing himself. "I didn't walk," Raphael said. "I shoved. You shoved me out of the way in a medical emergency. You were too slow." "I was." Elias stopped, shook his head. "You shoved me," he said, "and then you stayed." Raphael looked at him. "And then I stayed," he agreed. He said it like a promise delivered retroactively, which was exactly what it was. He crossed the kitchen and held Elias's face in both his hands, those hands, always those extraordinary hands, and looked at him for a moment without saying anything more. which was the vocabulary they had built between them, the eloquence of the pause, the full sentence of the held gaze, and the summer evening gathered itself outside, and the city turned its millions of lights on one by one. And somewhere in the hospital they had both given their working lives to, a heart was being held in careful hands, and another person was being kept in the world by the skill and attention of people who had chosen to spend their lives at the intersection of science and love, at the place where the body and the soul are not as separate as we sometimes pretend, and in the kitchen. Two of those people stood and held each other's faces and breathed, and the herbs sat in the colander, and something was, as ever, gently simmering